everyone, welcome back. This is Veronica from Sew It Seams. Welcome to my studio. Today we're going to work on part 3 of our jelly roll table runner. If you haven't caught the first 2 videos, go back to part 1 and part 2 to learn about how to make the top of the jelly roll table runner. Today we're going to work on basting and quilting and finishing off this table runner. So we're almost at the end, and soon you will have a table runner to be able to use on your own dining room table. So let's move over to my basting table.
I have my 3 layers of my table runner here. First I have my backing, and the backing, you'll notice I have it facing right side down so that the inside is up. I know it blows out. This is a real pale fabric, but my right side is on this side. My inside, or my wrong side, is right here. I layer my batting down, and then my table runner. And that is wrong side toward the batting and right side up. I don't have a large area to work. So I have found that if I just spread this out smoothly, make sure it's even and straight, I usually don't have a problem. Today I'm going to be basting with my pins. Sometimes I will do spray basting, but today we're going to do pins. I use a toothpick to help protect my fingers when I'm doing the pins. So what I'll actually do, and if you'll notice I've got just that little bit of extra going around my top so I'll have room. I'm going to start basting here and then move back. I know with my quilting I'm going to be quilting right in the line, so I'm going to be basting right in between, right on the strips. I've gone through each of the layers, all 3 layers. You want to either protect your surface or have something down that you don't care about picking just a little bit with your pin. And you'll see I've got my pin. You can see it's kind of hard to see, but there's the little pin is sticking through right there. So it's gone all the way through. And on this row, I'll just need this here. So I'll come up here, and what is that? 1, 2, 3, probably every 3 rows I'll pin, and I'll go down through the whole thing. Making sure to smooth it out as you go so you don't get wrinkles and such. Okay, I've got the first section pinned. I'm going to move my pins over, and what I do then is I'm just going to slide my quilt up so I can keep pinning. And grab all 3 layers and just slide it up. And I made sure not to shift anything, and then starting from where I pinned I can brush it down. I'm starting to shift a little, so I've got a little fold there. Undo that. And now I can keep pinning. I'm going to continue on through the whole thing. Oh, look at that, I just spilled all my pins. That's alright, we'll use them. One left over. I almost spilled out exactly what I needed. And now our table runner is basted. All the pins are together. I can move this and I won't have to worry about it coming apart. And now I'm ready to take this to the machine. I am now setting up my machine to do straight line quilting on the table runner. When I'm doing straight line quilting, I like to use a walking foot. The walking foot has grooves on the bottom of it that, as you're stitching, will help to grab the fabric on the top. So I'll be putting the walking foot on my machine, and I'm also going to be using just a neutral gray to do the quilting. I do have the same thread in the bobbin as I do in the top. My machine is set up. I am going to get my quilting gloves on. Even when it's a small project, I like to wear my quilting gloves because it has little grippers right here, almost like garden gloves, but it has grippers that help to hold on to the fabric, because fabric can be really slippery. And when you're trying to move 3 layers, it can be a lot of strain on your wrist and on your hands. And you notice my quilting gloves are getting holes, partly because I have long fingers, and even when they say they're large, the gloves are too small. But that's it. Okay? Now here's my table runner. The way that I'm going to quilt is I'm going to do what's called stitch in the ditch, and I'm just going to quilt right in the line down each seam. And that's what I'm going to do through the whole thing. I'm going to set my machine at kind of a long stitch. I'm going to go about 4. I don't need to have a really tight stitch. If I make a mistake, it's easier to pull it out. My hands are just guiding. I'm not pulling, I'm not shifting, I'm just guiding the fabric through, and I tend to kind of spread it out to make sure it doesn't bunch up underneath. Because even though I have pins, there's enough space where it could kind of bunch up. So I'm just putting my hands out to make sure that it stays nice and smooth and even. Now for some quilts I might go back and then come up. But for this one I'm just going to, it's easier for me to not move this around and turn my fabric. Just with the way this setup is, it's just easier for me to go straight down the line. So here we go with my next one. Alright guys, I've run into a problem. And I'll talk about this more, but do you see how this is all, it's almost like it's shearing or shirring, whatever you call it, where you gather up rows. I am not happy with that. I made a few mistakes, which I'll talk about later, but I'm ripping this out and we're going to do free motion meandering throughout the whole thing instead of the rows with the walking foot. I'll talk about that in a minute, but this, I thought I could live with it, but nope, I can't do it. So I've got to rip this out. But thankfully I kept my stitches a little bit longer so I can rip it out. I'm going to do it on this back side because I could see it better. And I'll just pick out the stitches.
While I'm doing the free motion quilting, let me explain a little bit more in detail the mistakes that I made in trying to base this quilt. My first mistake was in the number of pins that I used. I should have done at least 5 pins on each row that I was pinning. And then with the spacing of the rows, I probably should have gone every other row. And that would have helped to alleviate some of the bunching and the gathering that I was ending up having when I was doing the quilting with my walking foot. My second mistake was in my choice of batting. My batting is a poly batting, which in itself is not a problem, but with the the infrequency of the pinning, I needed a batting that wasn't quite so poofy or thick, and the poly batting has quite a bit of spring to it. If I had used a wool batting, then that would have held together just a little bit tighter, a little bit better. My third mistake was in just my basting method. I was using or trying to use the weight of the quilt to help pull it out so that it had a nice tautness to it. But the table runner was so light that I couldn't rely on any weight. So those three things caused my quilting to, in the straight line, to really become problematic. And what I should have changed those three things. But in order to make this work and not have to go through the entire basting process again, I just went to free motion quilting, which you can see me doing here. And it's just an easy meander that works really well with the poly batting.
Alright, it's now all quilted. I'm going to go through and I'm going to remove all my pins because they don't need to be in there anymore. I'm going to go through and remove all my pins, and then I'm going to trim off the backing and the batting from the sides.
I got all my strips sewn together to create my binding, and you can see got just a long strip here of the different fabrics. What I've done with each seam is when I've sewn them together, I've pressed the seams open. I press the seams open on the binding because if you press them to one side, you're going to end up getting a lot of bulk coming up through that particular seam as you come over it. So I've pressed my seam open, and I've taken my binding and I've pressed it all in half. The strips are 2.5 inches wide, and this is about the typical size that I make the bindings for my quilt. It makes a kind of a small binding. It works well for me. So now my binding is ready to attach to my quilt. I am now ready to attach my binding to my table runner. Since I am machine sewing it completely down, I will stitch my binding to the back side of my table runner. That way, when I am done sewing, I can flip it over to the front side and attach it on. To begin sewing my table runner binding down, I will start midway on one of the sides. I don't want to start right at a corner, and I also don't want to start at the edge of my binding. So I'll find a point kind of several inches down from the corner, and also a point several inches into my binding. And that's where I will begin to sew. I want the end of my binding so that I can have it when I'm finished sewing, so I can finish off that binding very neatly. So I line up my raw edges, the raw edges of my binding and the raw edges of my quilt, and I will just sew 1/4 of an inch in all along that edge. When I come to the corner, I will treat that a little differently. As I come to the corner of my table runner, I don't want to stitch all the way to the end. I need some room to be able to create a mitered corner. So as I'm stitching, I will stitch down to within 1/4 of an inch of the end of my quilt edge. When I come to the end, I will break the thread. Don't do a back tack. Just go ahead and cut the thread right there. And now I'm going to start folding my binding. It's easier if you turn it. To first fold up at a 45-degree angle so that my corner of the fold, as you can see there, I have a nice straight edge coming up from the edge of the table runner and continuing on with that binding. There's a nice 45-degree angle. I keep it very precise so that it has a nice straight edge coming all the way up. And then I will take the binding and right at the top edge there, I will fold it down. So now I also have a straight edge coming along the top of my quilt. The 45-degree angle you can see causes my edges to match up, and I have a nice even edge along the top and along down the side. At this point, when I've folded it, I will pin this corner so that it doesn't shift as I'm trying to stitch down. But I will continue stitching right along that edge, right up at the corner. So I'll start up at the corner, once again a 1/4 of an inch from the edge, and at this time I will back tack so that it makes a knot and holds it in place and it doesn't start to get loose or come apart. And then I will continue to sew along the edge, keeping my binding nice and straight along the edge of my quilt. And I will do this process around all 4 corners, and it'll create a nice mitered corner. I have now just sewn my last mitered corner, and I'm coming close to where I began stitching around. I want to stop my stitches for this binding about hand width, maybe 1.5 hands apart, just to give me enough room to be able to work. Don't back tack, just go ahead and cut the thread at this point because now I'm going to be needing to sew the binding together. With my binding strips, I will lay one down. I'm laying down the right hand side and I'm making sure it's nice and flat against my quilt, and then I will fold it back on itself, creating a crease. I want to make sure that I've got 3 or 4 inches there to work with. Now I'll also do the same thing with the other side of the binding. So on the left hand side, I will also keep it nice and flat and fold it back. I'm meeting the folds in the center, and I'm also leaving just a little bit of a gap between the folds. I'll show you. It's not much. I'm going to be leaving just about, golly, a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch difference. You see there, they're not quite touching. There's just a little bit of a gap. Make sure to have a nice crease there. Now on my right hand side, where that crease was created, I'm going to cut right along that fold. Now for the left hand side, I'm going to use the piece that I just cut off to mark how far I need to cut the other piece. So as you can see, so starting at the fold of the left side, I'm going to open up this cut off binding piece. So instead of the 2.5 inch, so instead of it being folded in half, now I have the full 2.5 inches. And where it meets on the other side is where I cut it off. This now gives me the exact amount of room that I need to be able to sew these two ends together to create a nice smooth edge. I will open up both of the bindings because they need to sew together. I have to turn the one on the right hand side at a 45-degree angle so I can sew them together on the bias. So I open up the left hand side and I leave it pretty straight. With the right hand, I will turn it up 45 degrees and I match it. Let me show you there. So I'm opening up the left hand side and then I open up the right and I turn it at a 45-degree angle, right sides together, and I match the points. I have corner that I can match right there, and I will match the edges on both sides right to the points. And even though we left a gap, this is still a little tight to work with, so you do want to pin this down. I smooth that edge down. The corner is right there at the edge, and I'll pin it right at that corner. And I'll do the same on the other corner. I'll pin right at that corner because that is going to be where I'm stitching. I'm stitching from corner to corner right across the bias. And I can also match right in the middle. It's a little hard to see, but I'm matching the fold points. So the fold from one to the other, I just put a pin right into the middle, and that is where my stitching is going to go right across. So I'll make a nice diagonal stitch from the upper corner all the way across to the lower corner. At this point, you just need to scrunch up your quilt the best that you can, because at this point it doesn't matter what that's doing. You want to get this nice and straight and try to keep it as nice and even as possible. Once I have that seam sewn right across there, then I can trim off that corner triangle, leaving about 1/4 of an inch. Now I'll take that seam and just finger press the seams open so it doesn't create too much bulk. But it can get awkward trying to get my iron in there. So I just finger press that open and then fold it in half, and also kind of press that down with my fingers. And then when I lay it flat against my quilt, it's nice and smooth. I don't have a bulk or any gathering or um, any extra fabric from either the quilt or the binding. It has a nice smooth fit. and then I just pick up where I had left off my stitching, and I stitch down the remaining part of the binding. And then my binding is attached. Now I can take my binding and flip it over around to the other side to start stitching it down. First thing that I do when I am bringing my binding to the front is to work on the corners to create those miters. So I come up to the corner and it automatically wants to fold over, but I will help to get it nice and flat. So on the top part, I will fold it over so it creates a nice 45-degree angle. And then I can get that other part, the top part, folded right up on top. And it takes just a little bit of maneuvering with your fingers to try to get it nice and flat and straight to create that really nice 45-degree angle. And you can really work on that and making those points match right at the corner. And then I put a pin in there so that when I'm stitching around, I can come right to that point and you get a nice miter right there on the stitching. So I will mark that on each of the corners first, and then I will start stitching all the way around. When I'm stitching my binding down, I don't start right at the corner. I will often start just before or just after. But I roll my binding over and I'll stitch right along the edge, making sure to catch that edge. I don't worry too much about the back of the quilt because that isn't really going to be noticeable, but right on the front I try to get right at the edge, so it's like a top stitching stitch. And I just stitch all the way around. As I come to the corner, I really want to maneuver the fabric to keep it right in place so that I can get a nice good stitch at the corners. I'll go slow and make sure that I can pivot right at that corner. And there we have the first corner sewn. Now I'll continue to just sew around the quilt, around the table runner in the same way. As I come to each corner, I will make sure to have a nice, good mitered corner on all four corners. As I continue sewing around the table runner, I will work each corner as I did with the first miter, and then when I come to the end, my binding should be nice and flat and I can just finish off that particular seam. And that is how you make a table runner out of a jelly roll. I do hope you've enjoyed making this table runner with me. I apologize for some of the issues with some video and audio. I'll see if I can get that working for the next video. But for now, enjoy some pictures of the final product of the table runner now on my own table. If you've made a table runner, I would love to see some images. You can share them with me at my email, SewItSeamsCreations@outlook.com. This is Veronica Johnson with Sew It Seams, and remember, keep stitching.